It is still morning, so good morning. And thanks for sticking with us here. And welcome to the supply chain panel. It has a long title, but that's what we're focused on. And I want to start out by talking to you all about how pleased I am to be moderating this panel at this time, even with all we have ups and downs, mostly ups in California, but we can talk about all the challenges. And really being truly thankful for the collaborative spirit of many in this room. I think we keep emphasizing that as we continue to navigate the emergence of a new industry that can provide renewable, firm power, as they like to say at the Energy Commission. So you heard, I'm Nancy Kirshner-Rodriguez with the Oceantic Network. Just a couple little things about me. My career started in Washington, D.C., where I spent close to 2 decades in and out of government, including almost 8 years in the Clinton administration. I know most of you don't remember that, but anyway, overseeing intergovernmental affairs for 2 cabinet members, and then coming to live full-time in the wonderful state of California, where I've held roles in local and state government and the private sector before landing at the Oceantic Network, which is a national nonprofit organization focused exclusively on advancing offshore wind and other ocean renewable industries and their supply chains. And I've now worked in this industry for more than 7 years, weaving a tapestry together. That's how I like to think of it. And seeing disparate communities come together for a shared vision, which, again, I think everyone's been really emphasizing. And so the reason I guess I'm here as the moderator of this is we are a wholly focused supply chain organization, but we launched in 2024 the West Coast Supplier Council, which is focused on the unique needs and development of the supply chain. And exactly 1 year ago, we released a report called The Supplier's Guide to Success, with a whole bunch of recommendations, very focused for the full build out of floating offshore wind on the West Coast, and a lot of different proposals. And Seth Price, who we'll be talking in a minute, is with Principal Power. They are one of the founding members of the West Coast Supplier Council. I know that several other key people with Offshore Wind California, Tony Appleton, Amy Monnier, Jason Bush, several of them are very involved. And Seth's going to talk more about our focus, and I will get back to it. But we also have today, of course, 2 key state agency folks, because as you know, there's many agencies in the state that are playing a critical role in developing this industry and attracting and figuring out how to support a local supply chain. And so I want to have each of our panelists introduce themselves and their current role, and I also want them to tell us all what they're hoping to see happening in their company, organization, agency in 2035. So for me personally, in 2035, a decade from now, I want to be riding on a Coast Guard cutter to visit some of the first offshore wind farms being under construction from a revitalized port area with lots of workers from the communities and lots of stories of the supply chain contributing. So I'll talk more about all of that and how we hope to see these things happen, but I'll start now with Seth.
All right, so introduction, 2035.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Seth Price. I'm the Vice President of Technology and Innovation at Principal Power. I've been working my whole career in deploying offshore energy devices, and the last decade in floating offshore wind specifically. For those who don't know, Principal Power is a floating offshore wind technology and service provider. So you've probably seen our platform on a number of different images over the past few days. So we essentially license the intellectual property for those platforms and then provide design services, everything concept engineering through detail design, as well as support fabrication, installation, operations, and maintenance. In 2035, what I would like to be doing is be retired. I don't think that's going to happen. So I guess I would settle for a surfing trip with my two boys. They're 2 years old and 4 years old right now. And maybe when we're surfing, we'll get to see some of the first units being towed, outside Morro Bay to the new wind energy area.
Cool. Lizzie?
Good morning, and thank you, Nancy. I'm Lizzie Barminski, an offshore wind specialist with the California Energy Commission. My work focuses on 3 very interrelated topics: ports, workforce, and supply chain. And I bring with me to the state some industry experience. I have started my career in offshore wind, as Nancy reminded me, almost 10 years ago, which is crazy to think about. But I've previously had been supporting the industry from an educational and networking perspective, and got the opportunity a few years ago to come to the state of California, my home state, to work on offshore wind and the strategic plan that the Energy Commission and all of the interagencies have been working on the past few years. So as part of the Offshore Renewable Energy Unit at CEC, I've been involved with planning for offshore wind with the Offshore Wind Strategic Plan directed by AB 525. We also work on AB 209, the port infrastructure funding, and our planning for Prop 4 funding as well, and Assembly Bill 3, which we'll be diving into on this panel today. Great. Looking ahead 10 years in 2035, I hope the CEC is continuing to support the long lead time resource of offshore wind and supporting implementation of the recommendations from the strategic plan, as well as some of the findings from AB3 informing policy decisions and hopefully seeing some realization of those.
Great. And Rohimah Moly. I know we go by Moly.
Hi, Rohimah Moly. Some of you know me as Moly with the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development with the Energy and Climate Unit. So, GO-Biz is the state's leader in job growth, economic development, and business assistance efforts. The team, there's different teams at GO-Biz that works to attract and retain businesses by providing guidance and services on site selection, permitting assistance, trade development, and assistance with state government. The energy unit, what I do day in and day out is work with a lot of developers, renewable energy developers, in helping them with my counterparts at the PUC, CAISO, and the CEC, is to help them make sure that their projects come online. So these projects are usually contracted projects that the state is expecting to come online that will help meet our SB 100 goals. So challenges in permitting, interconnection, supply chain, things like that. We work together, the 4 agencies work together to try to break through some of those challenges. Offshore wind is kind of like on the horizon for us, but we know that that is coming, and so there's a lot of coordination, I think, at the front end that can be done in terms of the 4 agencies working together. What I would like for myself in 10 years is to be a lady of leisure. What does that mean? Not working. But, in terms of offshore wind, I think it would be incredible to be able to see it in California shores, like driving down the highway and being able to see that. And being able to say, hey, I was part of that. help to get those built.
Great. So I know many of the people in this room are very well versed in what is happening. And last week I was a little bit nervous about this panel because, of course, the Empire Wind project in New York had a stop work order on it. And I'm sure there's people in this room that were working on trying to not have that be the case anymore. And so when we look at things from a national perspective, it has been such an exciting 4 or 5 years. We now have a U.S. offshore wind supply chain that's been emerging now for amazing over a decade. And when I say we, Oceantic Network, we track supplier contracts. So just to give you a sense of this picture, we have identified with the offshore wind that is in the process of being developed, over 1,600 supplier contracts, and they stretch over 40 states already. They include coastal communities, Midwestern manufacturing towns, and they really utilize expertise developed over decades with many different industries. So I think we know that there are great opportunities for California and the West Coast states of Oregon and Washington as we look over the long term. We also embarked on an effort to identify companies that could be in the supply chain, and we have already identified over 600 companies in the West, and it's just a blip that could, based on what they currently do, have a role in the supply chain. So that's even a good number to be starting with. And I really think, like, because California, we're dreamers and doers, and it really does permeate everything that's done here. So I want to take a deep dive into what we know about the West Coast and what we more need to do. And I'm going to turn to Seth, because I know you've been working on the DOE-sponsored Flow-In Prize competition. Could you tell us about what was studied and how it pertains to supply chain readiness?
Sure, Nancy. For those who aren't familiar, Department of Energy sponsored a really interesting 3-phase prize competition, which was called the Flow-In competition. It was all about contestants or competitors looking to assess what are realistic execution plans for U.S. projects in deploying floating offshore wind, with a real focus on maximizing domestic production. So we actually just concluded the 3rd phase of the program, and we did about a year's worth of work with a great group of partners. We partnered with Navantia, who is a Spanish fabricator, Pemamec, who is a company specialized in automation and robotics, and then ABS to work on how we can maximize quality in different types of distributed supply chain scenarios. So what we did in this 3rd phase of the project is essentially we took a 1 gigawatt size project and said, okay, how can we realistically deploy 1 gigawatts of floating offshore wind at the Morro Bay wind energy area, utilizing Port of Long Beach's envisioned Pier Wind facility as the hub. And what we wanted to do is really take a look at sort of 3 different types of scenarios. So we took a look at sort of a baseline scenario where, if we're assuming no major investment into manufacturing infrastructure in the U.S., how could we deploy 1 gigawatt size project, and then how could we scale that up? So for that case, we worked with different fabricators and essentially had a scenario where we were manufacturing the major platform primary steel subcomponents in Korea, bring them over to the Port of Long Beach, doing assembly and wind turbine integration at Port of Long Beach, and hitting around 40% domestic content in terms of sort of the platform production itself. And then what we wanted to do is, still assuming no major infrastructure and investments outside of sort of the ports and transmission, what are the ways, what's the low-hanging fruit in terms of how we can increase domestic content? So for that scenario, we still planned on importing the majority of the subcomponents over from Asia, but we really took a look at, okay, are there any components that we can manufacture throughout the U.S.? So we engaged a lot of the tier 2, tier 3 facilities in the U.S., primarily in Texas, in the Gulf, but also looking a bit at what's established along the West Coast and in California, Oregon, and Washington. And in that scenario, we were able to hit about 50% domestic content. There's a lot of things that can be done domestically, even without doing the primary steel work here in the U.S. Boat landings, walkways, anchors, even some of the primary steel truss elements. And then what we did, this was sort of the fun part of the exercise, we worked with Pemamec and we worked with Navantia on essentially what would a custom-built wind float factory or what would a custom-built floating wind manufacturing facility look like to be placed near one of the ports. Obviously, there's a lot of investment that would have to take place to make that a reality, and that would be, potentially, 6 to 8 year lead time to actually have that come to fruition. So that's maybe not realistic for these first wave of projects that are likely to enter the water in 2035. But it is potential for the second wave of projects as we're looking at sort of the statewide target of 25 gigawatts by 2045. And that was really interesting because we got to fully design from the ground up a new manufacturing facility, really focused on maximizing quality, throughput, seeing how much that would cost, what it would take to permit, design, and build that. And we were able to reach 100% domestic content in that scenario. And so I think what it taught us is that, there's a lot of different ways to deploy floating wind in California. And, as we're looking at different ways to do it, all of them have different impacts on jobs, on workforce, on cost, on schedule, even on quality risks. And so it's good to sort of look at the bookends and then over the next few years work with the developers, work with the state agencies to sort of see, what's realistic right now to get the industry up and running, and then what actionable steps can we take to increase domestic content over the coming years?
Perfect. That's a perfect segue to Lizzie. AB 525, which we've talked about here, and how significant it was, and that its broad mandate started to give the state a clear path to really consider. And then, of course, as Assemblymember Zabur talked yesterday about AB 3 was passed and has added a lot of inquiry that we need to do next step. And I mean, actually, just from what Seth was just talking about, I'm hoping that as this process, which I'm hoping you can talk more about the AB 525, and now this new discussion that we're going to have on AB 3, how they build off each other, but also how we most effectively look at the different increments of domestic content and the timeline for potentially growing that domestic content over time.
Sure, thanks, Nancy. So we're all familiar with AB 525, the Offshore Wind Strategic Plan, and really that the research and the reports that came out of that legislation are foundational and will serve as a starting point for continued work on AB 3. There's actually some of the legislative findings in the AB 525 language provide some context for AB 3 as well. Looking at commercial scale offshore wind, which can provide economic and environmental benefits. Offshore wind is an opportunity for California to continue advancing clean energy and climate goals, while also focusing on economic development and workforce benefits. It presents an opportunity for us to work on developing and preserving the skilled and trained construction workforce to carry out the projects and focus on long-term job creation as well as the development of the offshore wind supply chain. The strategic plan does acknowledge that there's challenges associated with supply chain development, and we know that a fully developed offshore wind industry and supply chain in the state will require time and considerable investment. So offshore wind is a long lead time resource, and it requires synchronized development of multiple large projects. With those projects, there's opportunity for job creation and business creation in the offshore wind industry cluster, the need for port modernization and upgrades, the new transmission, supply chains, manufacturing, research and development all offer opportunity for job creation and transition, as well as expansion or repurposing the supply chain businesses, and the opportunities for partnerships that support the creation of high quality, good paying jobs. And with AB3, that's a next step in unlocking the offshore wind potential in the state. The legislation directs the CEC to author and submit 2 reports in the next couple of years. The first report is a second phase plan and strategy for seaport readiness, which is due at the end of next year, 2026. And the second report is a supply chain feasibility study looking at 50 and 65% in-state assembly and manufacturing. And in developing those reports, there's lots of requirements that are laid out in the legislation, directing us to look at minimizing impacts and maximizing benefits, including the workforce opportunities for both local communities as well as tribal nations. So throughout the work, it is outlined our role to consult with federal, state, and local agencies, as well as tribal governments, key stakeholders, and interested parties. I think with that first report, that's really our focus initially, to meet that first deadline and build off of the work done in the strategic plan, outlining, I guess, refreshing and providing a little more perspective there, and there's a lot of public input that we're seeking, but that focus on the ports and a touch on workforce, and that does lay a foundation for the supply chain studies and the direction we want to go with the second study, which really is helping the state to make sense of what we can do in California, or maybe what we shouldn't be focused on. And there's a lot to look into. It's the legislation isn't a mandate, it's or a policy direction. It's a study and looking into what's possible for California to be a part of it for the whole supply chain.
Great.
Yeah, thanks.
I think that, you heard it from others who have moderated panels, but I hope that all of you who represent the many different industries that make up, and organizations and advocacy that make up the tapestry will, be very engaged in these next step efforts, because it's definitely really important. While at the same time, we're almost simultaneously thinking about, how do we start activity, I hope, in some of the ports soon. So Moly, this is a good segue then to GO-Biz works to attract and retain businesses by providing guidance, services on site selection, permit assistance, trade development, assistance with state government, et cetera. And I know that the governor unveiled the Jobs First economic blueprint last month. How does this plan assist with building out the offshore wind industry?
So the Jobs First initiative I started about a couple years ago, where it divided the California into 13 regions, and those 13 regions worked together to develop their local economic development plan, which was then fed into the state, and then that became the blueprint. So for a very long time, California didn't have a long-term economic development plan, so this is kind of like the first, and it's broken out into big three categories, which is, you know, what do we see on the horizon, what industries, and where we're going to, you know, focus and make a priority, and what's in the bet category that we know is coming that needs more support, and offshore wind is in that category. So how can this assist with offshore wind is that because it is a bottom-up approach, the locals have identified what they want to focus on, and their efforts. So for example, in the Redwood North Coast, the big thing is building out the offshore wind industry out there because, you know, there's a lease out there. And looking at that, taking their plan, we can start looking at stacking incentives. You know, what are the local economic development incentives that are available? What are the state incentives that are already available? And what's available at the federal level? Currently, doesn't seem to be many right now, but hopefully that will change in the future. But being able to better coordinate on those types of issues and challenges in terms of, you know, where the state is going, and also looking at, you know, because this blueprint is statewide, looking at where the priorities are for some of these regions. And so if we're looking at what the supply chain could look like and what regions focus on what, then we would know, like, hey, the South wants to do this. This is what they're interested in. This is what they already have a site for. This is what is in their general plan. And so we can look at that and say, hey, it makes sense to do this here and do this here, and we have all of the support already available to go into it instead of, you know, starting from scratch. So, and it's iterative. So I think AB3 will help inform and guide a lot in how to develop further the regional economic opportunities in terms of building out the supply chain for offshore wind here in California.
Great. And I'm watching our time. And Seth, in that, do you have any lessons from your European pre-commercial project experiences that can help with supply chain readiness for the first California projects?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's three main categories of, I guess, lessons learned. I mean, I'd love to talk at length about all the different lessons learned we've had over the last, 10 years or so of project deployment experience, but ones that are very applicable to the industry. One, and this is not just for Principal Power and the wind float, but for all technology developers, is really proving the technology. I think someone earlier today used the analogy that, California is sort of skipping the crawling and the walking stages, and we're going right to running. The first time you run a marathon, you don't want to be doing it with a new pair of shoes. And so I think it's very important that the technology is proven. I think these pre-commercial projects have been very good opportunities to prove the technology, to take them from a technology readiness level of 2 or 3, where it's just a vision, to 9, where you are serially manufacturing a small quantity of them. Windfloat Atlantic, the project developed by Ocean Winds, which uses a Vestas 8.3 megawatt turbine and Principal Power Windfloat foundations, that just celebrated its 5th anniversary. There's a lot of lessons learned that we've gleaned over the years that we're continuing to recycle into the next generation of designs. And again, I think if you're going to go straight into a sprint, straight into a run, with gigawatt-sized projects, 5 gigawatts off the coast of California, the last thing you want to do for that stage or for that strategy is to have serial defects. So these are really complicated projects. On the engineering side of things, you have the sort of the coupled effects of the aerodynamics of the turbine with the hydrodynamics of the platform. and a host of different interdependencies. So really being able to study those not just at model scale, but at full scale is really important, so that for the first projects, we can focus on more of sort of how do we make these more fabricatable? How do we execute these projects in a way that's economical and that's focused more on, I'll say, deployability than sort of just cost optimization. Watching my time, but just briefly here, I also want to say, I think these pre-commercial projects and the work being done in Europe and Asia right now is very important for establishing relationships. You don't want to be shaking hands with your business partners for the first time on a live project. There's a lot of learnings that can take place between designers and fabricators, between all members of the supply chain. Some of those learnings are better done off project through collaboration agreements. Some are better done on small projects. But again, a lot of these things you don't want to be tinkering with on the first utility scale projects. And I guess that gets to my last point, which is around contract structures. I think pre-commercial projects are a bit lower stakes. There's still tens of millions of dollars. These are still real projects with real financial incentives, real jobs at stake, real benefits at stake for the persons. But again, they're lower stakes than what we're talking about. We're talking about 5 gigawatts. So in terms of having everyone work together and have the same targets and not just sort of profit incentive targets, I think for the developers, learning what works for them in terms of a multi-contract approach versus an EPCI approach or some sort of hybrid in between, and being able to go to partners who already have those sort of relationships established is really important. And then the last thing I'll just say is when you're looking at lessons learned from European pre-commercial projects or first demonstrator units in Asia or otherwise, it's also really important just to understand, you know, what is a site-specific thing or project-specific thing that's going to need to be site-specific for the U.S. Not everything can be standardized, but a lot needs to be standardized, and that was spoken to before. So I think the pre-commercial projects are really important to understand, okay, what elements can we standardize, and that's going to be consistent across all projects, all developers, potentially across all wind turbine manufacturers, and then what is complex enough or has enough of a CapEx impact that it's absolutely essential that this is project specific or site specific.
Thanks. And I guess I would add, and maybe you know this, but like we are learning a lot from everything that's been happening on the East Coast, as you've heard. But the thing about floating offshore wind that's so exciting is that it hasn't really been commercialized in a lot of places yet. I know we've got some things happening in China, but Principal Power, which I don't know if you gave your own ad, that is based here in California, in Emeryville, has been very visionary, and it is important for us to think about floating offshore wind for our state, for our region, and for our broad region across the large Pacific Ocean, that there's an opportunity for us to also be thinking about what can we develop that then can be exported down the road. And I say that because another member of our supplier council, Nexans, which is a France-based company, built a plant in South Carolina, and they are supplying cable to projects on the East Coast, but they're also supplying cable to projects in Europe. So now, and those are American jobs. So I know we only have like 2 minutes. I don't see any audience questions here, but does anyone in the audience have a question? Anyone? If so, stand up and speak. Wait, loud. don't know. Molly, do you? I mean, I can talk about it a little bit from the Oceantic perspective because we both do train. We were able, thanks to Vineyard Wind, actually to do, I think, one of our first trainings up in Humboldt County that does really try to focus in on the supply chain, what you need to learn, all the different linkages. That was in December, and we obviously hope to do a lot more of that. And I do believe that supply chain education and then coaching of small suppliers is important. And then hopefully we will be able to, help them through GO-Biz and others.
And one of the things Nancy and I, when we first met last year, talked about was how can GO-Biz partner with Oceantic in educating locals about offshore wind and understanding the potential opportunities. GO-Biz, the Cal Business Investment Team, has regional representatives who are embedded within their communities. And so one of the things, we're looking at doing is how do we, one, like I said, educate them about offshore wind, but two, understanding what the potentials are and how they can pivot. If you're a business that does X, that can slightly pivot to doing something that includes Y, that's getting ready for offshore wind supply chain, what does that look like? And so, we've been kind of in discussion about that and thinking about how can we best do that. And maybe that is partnering with the chambers and other local organizations and labor as well to kind of create what that strategy can look like going forward, since now is a time to kind of start that.
Thanks. Awesome. So I see that we're at 17 seconds, so I don't know if any of you, any other questions? It's hard to see. If not, any parting words of advice for things that you want to make sure this audience and others know?
Yeah, I think around AB3, the public and interested party knowledge and insights are going to be really valuable as we're developing those reports. So I want to reiterate the announcement from earlier today about our upcoming workshop. We are planning a kickoff in June on the 18th. It's virtual, so hopefully all of you could participate, but definitely want to raise that the development of those reports is going to involve a lot of public engagement and input. So looking forward to learning from you all as part of our development.
Anyone else? If not, I want to thank they keep giving us time. I want to thank Offshore Wind California for inviting our entire panel to participate, and I hope you will see us as partners to dialogue going forward, and we look forward to working with all of you as we make this vision a reality over the next few years. Thank you.
Thank you.